It all began with an email. I was at my drafting table, putting the final touches on a blueprint for a new community center. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across my apartment. It was a perfectly ordinary day, quiet and productive. Then my phone chimed with a notification. The sender was an address I didn't know, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Confidential alert, Zurich Private Bank. I felt my breath hitch in my chest as I tapped it open. The language was sterile, formal, and devastatingly precise. Dear Ms. Clara Evans, this serves as a confidential alert regarding an unauthorized attempt to access Vault 34B. For your protection, a security protocol has been initiated and a temporary hold has been placed on the vault pending client verification. Please contact your private wealth advisor, Mr. Sterling, at your earliest convenience. Before we get into what happened next, do me a favor and like this video, subscribe to my channel, and drop me a comment to let me know where you're watching from in the world. My heart didn't just sink. It felt as though a block of ice had materialized in my stomach. Vault 34B. I didn't have to check any records. That designation was seared into my brain. It was my grandmother's vault, my Grandma Beatrice. It was a secret world she had built for me, a financial fortress that only she and I were meant to have the keys to. It was the legacy she had promised me, the one thing she swore would be my foundation, my safety net, long after she was gone. No one else knows, Clara, she had told me, her voice a fragile rasp in her final weeks. Not your mother, not your father. This is for you. This is your fresh start. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. Unauthorized attempt. Who would even know to look there? Who could possibly have the audacity? Before I could even think to dial the bank, my phone lit up with a call. The screen showed a picture of my mother, a perfectly manicured photo from a family cruise a few years back, a different lifetime. I stared at the smiling image, a knot of pure dread coiling in my gut. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold as a tombstone, that this was no coincidence. I took a deep breath and answered, "Hi, Mom." "Clara, honey," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. It was the voice she always used when she was about to ask for a huge favor or worse, deliver terrible news wrapped in a bow. "I was just thinking of you. We're having a little family dinner tonight. It's important." I gripped the edge of my drafting table, my knuckles turning white. "What's it about?" "Oh, nothing to get worked up about now," she chirped. "We'll discuss it tonight. It's just a family discussion." That phrase, a family discussion. In my family, that was the code. It was the polite air raid siren that blared just before the bombs fell. It was the formal invitation to your own character assassination. It never, ever meant anything good. It meant someone was about to be pushed out, and betrayal was the main course. And tonight, I had a sinking feeling I was on the menu. Walking into my parents' house was always like stepping into a magazine spread for a life I didn't recognize. It wasn't a home, it was a showcase. White rugs that no one dared walk on, glass furniture that showed every fingerprint, and abstract art chosen by a consultant for its appreciation value. There were no stacks of worn-out paperbacks, no sentimental clutter on the mantelpiece, no evidence of actual living. The air smelled of expensive diffusers and quiet resentment. It was the house I grew up in, but every trace of my childhood had been systematically erased years ago. They were all there, in the cavernous dining room, arranged around the ridiculously long mahogany table. The crystal chandelier overhead bathed them in a cold, unforgiving light, a perfect tableau of a family, and I was the ghost at the feast. My father, Richard Evans, sat at the head of the table, swirling his red wine, pointedly avoiding my gaze. He was a man who had built a corporate empire from the ground up, but couldn't muster the courage to look his own daughter in the eye. Beside him, my mother offered a tight, practiced smile. She was the stage manager of this whole production, making sure everyone knew their lines. And then there was the new, improved family unit. Helen, my father's second wife, sat opposite my mother. She was younger, with a soft-spoken demeanor and a smile that was all mechanics and no warmth. She was the reason this new family existed. Next to her, smirking as if he'd just been handed a trophy, was Mark, my stepbrother. At 38, he was 10 years my senior, and he had dedicated every single one of them to reminding me that I was a footnote in the Evans family story. His flawless wife, Sarah, sat beside him, cooing at their newborn son. The baby was the newest, most valuable prop in their play, the living symbol of their legitimate, more deserving lineage. I was the relic, the holdover from a past my father was desperate to bury. "Clara, you made it," my mother said, her voice echoing slightly in the tomb-like silence of the room. I took the only empty seat, way at the far end of the table, feeling like I was in a different zip code. A maid silently materialized and placed a glass of water before me. The silence stretched. The only sound was the nervous clink of my father's fork against his plate. He cleared his throat. "Clara," he started, his eyes still fixed on the table. "We wanted to have a talk with you about the future. Your grandmother's estate, to be specific," my mother added, seamlessly picking up the fumble. My hands went ice cold. I tucked them into my lap, hiding their tremor. I already knew. The email wasn't a warning shot. It was the sound of the bullet leaving the chamber. This dinner was the impact. "Your father and I have been speaking with Helen and Mark," my mother continued, gesturing gracefully, "and we've all come to a consensus on a new plan." My father finally met my eyes. They were filled with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Pity? Or just the exhausted expression of a man who had made his choice and didn't want a scene? "We've made some adjustments to the inheritance," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. "With Mark's new family, with the baby. We feel the assets are better utilized with them. It secures their future, the family's future." The silence in the room was absolute. The words just hung there, heavy and sharp like shards of glass. My inheritance. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing quarterly budget reallocations. But it wasn't just assets. It was my grandmother's house. It was the promise she'd made on her deathbed. The antique jewelry passed down through generations. The properties she'd shrewdly acquired. The portfolio she had painstakingly built, one stock at a time. It was everything she had wanted for me. Stolen over appetizers with polite smiles. My throat felt like it was closing up. I looked from my father's guilty, averted gaze to my mother's unwavering one. I saw Mark, desperately trying to arrange his face into a look of concern, but failing to hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. And then I looked at Helen, who placed a condescendingly gentle hand on my father's arm. "You don't need it, Clara," Helen said softly, her voice dripping with a poisonous false sympathy. "You've done so wonderfully for yourself. You're so independent. We're all just so proud of you." And that was it. That was the final, brutal twist of the knife. They weren't just stealing from me. They were using the very life I had built on my own, without a cent of their help, as the justification for why I didn't deserve what was rightfully mine. They weren't calling me strong. They were calling me alone, and therefore easy to rob. A bizarre, icy calm washed over me, The initial shock, the hot sting of betrayal, it all receded, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. I saw them for exactly who they were. Not family. They were a pack of wolves dividing a kill. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip. I set it down gently and smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was a mask. A small, polite curve of the lips. Just enough to put them at ease. Just enough to make them think I was broken. "I see," I said, my voice impossibly steady. "Thank you for letting me know." My father visibly relaxed. Mark's smirk finally broke free. They had braced for a storm, for tears, for shouting, for a messy scene. My quiet acquiescence was a surrender, and they accepted it with greedy relief. "Well," I said, pushing my chair back, "if that's everything, I should probably get going. I've got an early morning. You're not staying for dinner?" my mother asked, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes. "No," I said, standing up, my spine straight. "I've suddenly lost my appetite." I walked out of that dining room, my head held high. I could feel their eyes on my back, a mixture of relief and contempt. They thought I was shattered. They thought I was walking away defeated. They had no idea. I wasn't surrendering. I was retreating to find a bigger cannon. They mistook my silence for acceptance. They were about to learn it was a declaration of war. The drive home was a blur of smeared city lights and a roaring in my ears. The inside of my car felt like a vacuum, silent and suffocating. The polite, vicious phrases from dinner echoed relentlessly. Better utilized with them. "You don't need it, Clara. You're independent." Each one was a sharp little jab, a reminder of my new status, an inconvenience they had finally managed to sweep away. I pulled into my designated spot in the apartment building's garage and just sat there in the humming darkness, my hands clenched on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. For a few minutes, I let the full weight of it crush me. The profound, bottomless loneliness. The shocking clarity that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally saw me as nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet to be zeroed out. A part of me wanted to shatter, to scream until my throat was raw and beat my fists against the dashboard until my hands bled. But another feeling was rising up through the grief, a slow, hot burn from deep within my core. It was rage, and just beneath the rage, a memory surfaced. A quiet moment in a sun-drenched room that smelled of old paper and lavender. As I sat there in the dark, the memory came flooding back, as vivid as if it were happening right now. Grandma Beatrice in her final days. She was frail, propped up on a mountain of pillows, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. They were the same deep blue as mine. She had beckoned me closer, her grip surprisingly firm as her hand closed around mine. "They're going to try and take it, Clara," she had whispered, her voice thin but steel-edged. "After I'm gone, your father, he's a weak man, and your mother is a shark. They will look at what's yours and convince themselves it belongs to them." I tried to quiet her. "Grandma, don't say that. They're my family. They love me." She'd squeezed my hand harder, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. "Love has its price, darling. And for them, it's always been negotiable. They love the idea of family, the perfect picture. But at their core, they are selfish. I have watched them my whole life." Her words had terrified me back then. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe in the family from the holiday photos, the one that celebrated birthdays with cake and laughter. But my grandmother, she was never one for sentimentality. She saw the cracks in the foundation. "They'll try to take everything," she'd repeated, her gaze locking with mine. But I made sure they can't. From a small carved rosewood box on her nightstand, she produced a strange, antique-looking brass key. It wasn't a normal key. It was ornate, with a complex star-shaped head. It felt cool and heavy as she pressed it into my palm and folded my fingers over it. "Keep this somewhere safe, darling," she'd instructed. "Don't tell a single soul it exists. It opens a private deposit box at my bank in Zurich. The vault is yours. No one else can touch it. And neither can they touch the plan that goes with it." I had stared at the key, utterly bewildered. What plan? A small, cunning smile had played on her lips. The contingency, insurance for a day just like this one. "You'll know when the time comes. The bank will know. Just remember, Clara, they may think they're playing chess, but they're playing on a board I designed." Sitting in my car, that memory felt less like a sad farewell and more like a set of sealed orders, a battle strategy left behind by a 5-star general. The plan was being activated. That email from the Zurich bank wasn't a problem. It was the starting gun. My family had just confidently strode into a minefield they never knew was there. I finally killed the engine and went up to my apartment. I walked straight past my drafting table, into my bedroom, to the heavy antique armoire my grandmother had left me. I opened the door and ran my hand along the inside back panel until my fingers found the small, almost invisible latch. A false panel clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, was the ornate brass key. I picked it up. It felt different now. It wasn't a keepsake. It was a weapon. It was control. As I held it, the grief and the hurt didn't vanish, but they crystallized. They hardened into something new, resolve. They had drawn their line in the sand. They had declared war on me, assuming I was unarmed and alone. They thought they were taking from a girl who had nothing left. They were about to discover they had just tried to rob the woman who now held everything. My grandmother had seen this day coming. She had planned for it, and she had trusted me to finish it. A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was the thrill of a purpose so powerful it vibrated through my bones. I wasn't just Grandma Beatrice's granddaughter anymore. I was her executor, and class was about to be in session. The next morning, I didn't go to my office. I sent an email to my clients, my voice calm and my explanation brief. A family emergency. It wasn't a lie. I then made a second call, this one to the private number for Mr. Sterling provided in the bank's email. A polite, crisp assistant answered and patched me through without hesitation. Mr. Sterling's voice was measured with a faint, unplaceable European accent. He sounded completely unfazed. "Ms. Evans," he said, "I have been expecting your call. We have a great deal to discuss. I am in the city for the remainder of the week. Would you be available to meet at our local office this morning?" An hour later, I was seated in a hushed, minimalist office on the 60th floor of a glass tower that pierced the downtown sky. The panoramic view of the city was magnificent, but I barely saw it. The room itself was the real view, a space that radiated quiet confidence and generational wealth. It was the polar opposite of the loud, gaudy showroom my parents called home. This place was silent, serious, and formidable. Mr. Sterling was an older man, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. He had kind eyes, but the firm jaw of a man who guarded fortunes for a living, and did it exceptionally well. He greeted me not with a look of pity, but with a deep professional deference. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice, Ms. Evans," he said, gesturing to a seat at a gleaming conference table. "Your grandmother Beatrice was a most cherished client and an exceedingly wise woman. I had the privilege of serving as her advisor for over 3 decades. He sat across from me, his hands clasped on the table. She was also, shall we say, a brilliant strategist. She anticipated a great many eventualities. My heart was thudding against my ribs, but I kept my face a neutral mask. She told me you would know what to do. A small, sad smile touched his lips. Indeed. Beatrice established a very precise protocol for a situation exactly like this. The unauthorized access attempt on Vault 34B was the trigger. It has set her entire contingency plan into motion. He swiveled a large monitor on the table to face me. The screen was filled with scanned images of official bank documents. They were transfer requests, asset liquidation forms, and legal declarations. At the bottom of each one was a signature, Beatrice Evans. Except it wasn't. I'd seen my grandmother's elegant flowing script 1,000,000 times. This was a clumsy, almost childish forgery. Then, Mr. Sterling displayed another set of documents. A power of attorney, granting total control of Beatrice Evans's entire estate to a third party. It was dated just 2 weeks after her funeral. It was a complete and utter fraud. I felt the air leave my lungs. And then I saw the names listed on the forms. The names of the people who had submitted these forgeries, trying to seize control. Richard Evans, Mark Evans, Helen Evans, my father, my stepbrother, my father's new wife. My mother's name wasn't on the legal paperwork, but I knew she was the ghost in the machine, the director orchestrating from the wings. Seeing their names there, in stark black and white, made the betrayal absolute. It was one thing to hear the words spoken across a dinner table. It was another thing entirely to see the cold, hard proof of their conspiracy. The premeditation, the sheer, unadulterated greed. It was so much uglier than I had imagined. They attempted to liquidate all known assets and consolidate them into a new holding company under your stepbrother's control, Mr. Sterling explained, his voice perfectly even. They believed they had successfully seized your grandmother's entire portfolio. He looked at me, his eyes conveying a deep understanding. She anticipated this, he said again. She knew they wouldn't wait. She knew they would be sloppy, and she left very specific instructions for you. He reached into a fine leather briefcase by his side and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the wax crest of my grandmother's family, a hawk clutching a key. My name was on the front in her beautiful handwriting. For Clara. He slid it across the polished table. My fingers trembled as I took it. The paper felt heavy, important. I broke the seal. Inside was a single matching sheet, covered in her elegant script. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means they have finally shown their true colors. I am sorry, my darling. I am sorry for the pain this must be causing you, for the hurt I know you feel right now. I tried to shield you from this, but some things can't be stopped, only prepared for. They think you are weak because you are kind. They think you are naive because you are good. They have mistaken your heart for a flaw. They are about to learn what a catastrophic miscalculation that was. Grieve for the family you thought you had, my love. But do not grieve for long, because today is the day you stop being their victim and start being their consequence. I have given you every tool you need. Mr. Sterling will explain the mechanics. This is your legacy now. Not the money, not the properties, but the strength to defend what is yours. Show them what real power looks like. All my love forever, Grandma Beatrice. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it in my handbag. When I looked up at Mr. Sterling, the sadness in me had been forged into something hard as steel. My grandmother's voice was in my head, her last words to me now a direct order. Okay, I said, my voice clear and firm, explain everything. Mr. Sterling nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. With pleasure, Miss Evans. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Sterling didn't just walk me through a financial portfolio. He unveiled a fortress. He was like a master architect explaining the blueprints of an impenetrable citadel my grandmother had been designing for decades. I sat in stunned silence as he revealed layer after brilliant layer of her genius. "You must understand, Ms. Evans," he began, turning his monitor back towards me. "The Zurich Vault 34B was never the real treasure. It was the bait. It was the castle's front gate, designed to look valuable and just vulnerable enough to tempt a greedy fool." He showed me the account's contents. It held a substantial sum, more than enough to make my family reckless. But it was a pittance, a tiny fraction of the true Evans fortune. "Your grandmother structured her entire estate like a spider's web," he continued, pulling up a complex diagram of interconnected trusts and corporations. "Every single asset is legally intertwined with every other, and the Zurich Vault was the keystone. Any fraudulent attempt to touch it wouldn't just be blocked. It would trigger a system-wide lockdown, a financial earthquake, as she liked to call it. He detailed it for me, piece by agonizingly brilliant piece. First, the hidden real estate trusts. For 50 years, my grandmother had quietly acquired properties under a series of unassuming LLCs. Apartments in Rome, a villa in the south of France, commercial real estate in London and Tokyo. Their ownership was completely obscured. My family had no idea they existed. The moment they submitted their forged papers, an automatic legal injunction was filed in multiple countries, freezing any potential sale or transfer of those properties indefinitely. Next, the offshore investments. A vast, diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and private equity, all managed through shell corporations in jurisdictions they would never think to investigate. "Your grandmother enjoyed the game of making money," Mr. Sterling said with a wry smile. "She was exceptionally good at it." This part of the fortune was now also frozen, pending a full forensic audit triggered by the fraud attempt. They couldn't touch a single cent, but the final piece, the masterstroke of her plan, was the one that made me gasp. Mr. Sterling pulled up the corporate filings for Evans Corporation, my father's company, the source of his pride, his identity, and their entire lavish lifestyle. He pointed to a section listing the primary shareholders. My father's name was there, of course, but right below, it was the name of a private holding company I'd never heard of. "Beatrice Holdings, LLC," Mr. Sterling said quietly. "Over the last 20 years, your grandmother, through various intermediaries, systematically acquired a 40% stake in your father's own company. She was his silent, largest partner. He never knew. That stake makes a lot of money. She became his silent partner, and now you," he paused for emphasis, "are the controlling shareholder." I just stared at the screen, speechless. She owned him. All this time, she had owned the very thing he held most dear. "The moment they filed those forged documents," Mr. Sterling explained, "a specific clause in the Beatrice Holdings charter was activated. It mandates an immediate emergency audit of Evans Corp., citing suspected fraudulent activity by its chief executive, namely your father. It also gives you, as the new head of Beatrice Holdings, the authority to freeze all executive compensation, corporate credit lines, and company assets pending the investigation's outcome." My grandmother hadn't just built a defense. She had built a perfect, inescapable mousetrap, and my family had just spent the last 24 hours eagerly chasing the cheese right into the center of it, pulling the door shut behind them. They thought they were robbing a house, but they had just tried to default on a loan from the bank that owned their mortgage. As Mr. Sterling was explaining the final nuances, my phone, which I had placed face down on the table, began to vibrate. It buzzed once, then again and again, in a frantic, insistent rhythm. I couldn't resist. I flipped it over. The screen was a chaotic storm of notifications. A text from my mother. "Clara, what is going on? My credit cards were all just declined at Neiman Marcus. Call me immediately." An email from my father, subject line, "Urgent." "Clara, the bank just froze all our business accounts. They're talking about an audit. Did you say something to someone? We need to talk now." And then a string of texts from Mark, each more panicked than the last. "What did you do? My trust fund access is frozen. Sarah's card isn't working. What the hell did you do, Clara?" They were panicking. The earthquake had begun, and they could feel the ground crumbling beneath their feet, but they had no idea why. They were scrambling for someone to blame, and they had landed on me, the quiet, independent daughter they had so easily cast aside. I looked up from my phone, my heart pounding a triumphant rhythm. Mr. Sterling was watching me, his expression perfectly calm. He was the serene eye of the hurricane he had just helped unleash. "As you can see, the system is performing exactly as designed," he said. I looked at the frantic messages on my screen. I saw their panic, their confusion, their entitled rage turning to fear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was afraid. They were. With a steady hand, I reached down and pressed the power button on the side of my phone. The screen went dark. The buzzing stopped. I had silenced them. The rest of that day in Mr. Sterling's office was a whirlwind of legal documents and quiet directives. I was no longer just Clara Evans, architectural drafter. I was the head of Beatrice Holdings, the executor of my grandmother's will, and the commander of a financial war machine she had built in secret. The power was dizzying, but my grandmother had left a clear map, and the purpose was grounding. All I had to do was follow it. The real chaos, of course, was happening outside that silent, climate-controlled office. My family was caught in the tremor, and the aftershocks were ripping their world to shreds. That night, I was at home, pushing a salad around a plate with no real appetite, when my apartment buzzer screamed. I checked the video intercom. It was Mark. He was on my doorstep, his face a mask of crimson fury. He was shouting my name, his voice a distorted roar through the speaker. He buzzed again and again, then began hammering on the door with his fist. "Clara, I know you're in there. Open this damn door right now. What did you do?" My heart jumped into my throat. The old Clara would have been terrified. She would have hidden, cowering. She might have even opened the door to face his wrath. But I just stood there, watching his apoplectic performance on the tiny screen. I saw him for what he was, a spoiled, overgrown child throwing a tantrum because his allowance had been cut off. He had no real power, he was just loud. I turned the volume down on the intercom and went back to my salad. Eventually, the pounding stopped. The next day, the ripples spread further. I got a call from an old acquaintance, a woman named Jessica who worked in my father's finance department. She sounded terrified. "Clara? I don't know who else to call," she whispered. "It's a bloodbath here. They've shut down everything. All the corporate cards, the expense accounts. Mr. Evans was trying to close a major deal in Hong Kong, and his card was declined at the hotel. He had to fly back in coach. Everyone's panicking. There are auditors in suits crawling all over the place, going through every file. The rumor is the company's assets are frozen because of an investigation into executive fraud." "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of it, Jessica," I said, my voice even. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice dropping lower. "What they're whispering? That your father, that he did something illegal?" "The truth will come out," I said simply, and ended the call. The most satisfying collapse to witness, however, was Helen's. Her entire existence was constructed from my father's wealth and the social status it afforded her. She was the chairwoman of a dozen charity committees, her life a meticulously curated whirlwind of galas, luncheons, and social maneuvering. Her power was perception, and that perception was about to be shattered. I read about it on a high society gossip blog a few days later. Helen had been hosting her crown jewel event, the annual fundraising luncheon for the City Opera, at a Michelin-starred restaurant. According to the blog, when the time came to settle the $30,000 bill, her exclusive invitation-only black card was declined, then her platinum card, then her gold card, one by one, in front of everyone, in front of the very women whose validation she lived for. The whispers started instantly. The impeccably wealthy Helen Evans couldn't pay for lunch. The story was all over the city by evening. Her social standing had evaporated in a single mortifying afternoon. Throughout it all, Mr. Sterling provided calm, steady updates. The audit at Evans Corp has uncovered significant irregularities, Ms. Evans. Your father was using company funds to finance his and Helen's personal lifestyle, as well as to bankroll Mark's series of failed startups. Mark's primary trust account has been legally frozen. It appears its seed money was derived from a fraudulent loan secured against a Beatrice Holdings property he did not own. They are locked out, he told me during one of our calls. They have attempted to access every account they knew of. They have tried to leverage every asset they believed they controlled. At every turn, they have been met with a locked door. Your grandmother's contingency plan has functioned flawlessly. They are now, for all intents and purposes, completely powerless. I hung up the phone and walked to my large apartment window, looking out over the sprawling city lights. I didn't feel the rush of triumphant joy I thought I would. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of awe. My grandmother had seen their every move. She knew their greed, their arrogance, their carelessness. She hadn't just predicted their betrayal, she had mapped it, charted it, and used it as the very blueprint for their undoing. You really did think of everything, Grandma, I whispered into the empty room. The ache of their betrayal was still there, a dull throb in my chest. But it was being eclipsed by a growing respect for the woman who had loved me enough to plan for the day my own family would try to ruin me. She had left me a shield, a sword, and a kingdom to defend. And the time was fast approaching to finally step out from behind the walls and claim it. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of quiet, methodical dismantling and rebuilding. While my family's world was spectacularly imploding in public, mine was being privately reconstructed. Mr. Sterling and his team of lawyers and accountants worked tirelessly. Paperwork was filed, finances were untangled, and power was transferred with the silent stroke of a pen. I spent those weeks in a self-imposed crash course on my own life. I learned about international real estate, complex stock portfolios, and corporate governance. I learned about the empire my grandmother had quietly built. And in the process, I learned that I was stronger and far more capable than I had ever allowed myself to believe. Then the day came. I was not in my small apartment. I was sitting in a large, imposing leather chair behind a massive mahogany desk on the top floor of the Evans Corp building. It was my father's office, or rather it had been. The room had been scrubbed of his presence. The photos of him shaking hands with politicians were gone. The lingering masculine scent of his cologne had been aired out, replaced by the clean, faint smell of lemon polish and fresh orchids. The only personal item left was a single, elegant silver frame on the corner of the desk. It held a picture of my grandmother, smiling, her eyes twinkling with a secret she was finally sharing. A new plaque was being engraved for the door. It would not read Richard Evans, CEO. It would read Clara Evans, CEO, Beatrice Holdings. The name of the parent company had been changed. A subtle but seismic first step. It was never his company to begin with. My phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Sterling. All transfers are complete. Legal filings are ready for your signature. All assets are secure under your control. Shall we proceed with the family meeting? I looked at my grandmother's picture. Her smile seemed to give me a nod of encouragement. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming a legacy that had almost been stolen. Yes, I typed back. Send them up. Mr. Sterling had arranged it, a formal legal summons, a meeting they could not afford to miss. I watched from my floor-to-ceiling window as they arrived. Not in their usual fleet of luxury cars, but huddled together in a single modest sedan that was clearly a rental. They stepped out onto the pavement and looked up at the towering glass building, their building, with the lost expressions of tourists. When they were escorted into my office, the transformation was staggering. The easy arrogance, the entitled confidence that had permeated the dining room 3 weeks ago had completely vanished. They looked smaller, diminished. My father's expensive suit hung on him as if it were 2 sizes too big, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and gaunt. My mother's perfect mask had shattered. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands twisted the strap of her handbag nervously. Helen looked haggard, her soft smile replaced by a thin, tight line of pure fear. And Mark. The smirk was gone, wiped clean from his face, replaced by a sullen, resentful glare. He looked like a deposed king, stripped of his crown and forced to stand before his conqueror. His wife, Sarah, trailed behind them, holding the baby, her eyes wide with terror. They were no longer a portrait of a perfect family. They looked like desperate people who had bet everything on a fixed game, only to discover the house was playing against them. They clustered together just inside the doorway, hesitating, as if afraid to step further into the room that was once the epicenter of their universe. I didn't stand. I remained seated behind the desk, the throne, and gestured calmly to the chairs arranged before me. "Please," I said, my voice quiet and even. "Sit down." They shuffled forward and sat, a silent, broken tableau. The great and powerful Evans family, brought to their knees by a forged signature and a grandmother who had planned for their worst. The meeting was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I was at the head of the table. The silence in that office was so thick you could feel it pressing in. They sat rigidly in their chairs, their eyes darting around the room, looking at the floor, the art on the walls, anywhere but at me. They were braced for the emotional explosion I had denied them at the dinner table. They were expecting tears, accusations, a dramatic monologue. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Emotion was a currency they no longer deserved from me. I let the silence stretch, letting them stew in their own discomfort. Finally, I leaned forward, folding my hands on the polished mahogany. "Let's talk about fraud, shall we?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. My father flinched as if I'd slapped him. He began to stammer. "Honey, Clara, we can explain." "Explain what exactly?" I cut him off, my tone sharp and clinical. "The forged documents? The fraudulent power of attorney you filed 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral? The attempted illegal asset transfer from the Zurich vault? Which part would you like to explain first, Dad?" From a folder on my desk, I produced a thick stack of papers. I stood, walked around the desk, and began laying them out on the conference table between us, one by one. The crisp sound of each sheet hitting the wood was like a judge's gavel. This, I said, tapping the first document, is the forged signature on the Zurich bank forms. Our handwriting expert identified it as a clumsy attempt by you, Mark. Mark's face went from pale to ghostly white. This, I continued, laying down another sheet, is the fraudulent power of attorney, signed by you, Dad, as primary executor, and you, Helen, as a witness to a federal crime. I laid out the bank statements showing the attempted transfers, the property deeds, the corporate filings, a mountain of paper that documented their conspiracy in cold, hard ink. Undeniable proof, their entire scheme exposed on the table. They stared at the evidence, their faces a gallery of horror and disbelief. They were caught, utterly and irrevocably. I returned to my seat behind the desk. As of this morning, I said, resuming my calm, businesslike tone, I am the controlling shareholder of this corporation. I am the sole legal heir to the entirety of the Beatrice Evans estate, and you, I looked at each of them in turn, are perpetrators of felony bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery. My mother finally found her voice. It was a strained, reedy whisper. What are you going to do to us? I've been discussing that with my legal team, I said, and we have presented two options for you. I suggest you listen very carefully. I held up one finger. Option 1, I press charges. I hand this entire file over to the district attorney. Given the mountain of evidence, you will all be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. You will lose what little you have left, the houses, the cars, any money you've managed to hide. It will all be seized. You will face significant prison time. The Evans name will be synonymous with scandal and crime for generations. Your lives as you know them will be over. A small, choked sob escaped from Sarah. Helen, her own face ashen, reached out to put a hand on her arm. I held up a second finger. Option 2, I said, my voice dropping even lower. You sign full, detailed confessions of everything you did. You, Dad, will sign your immediate and unconditional resignation. You, Mark, will sign away any and all future claims to any family assets. All of you will sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement, promising to never speak of this to anyone, ever. In exchange, I will not press charges. I will provide you with a modest yearly stipend, enough to live on quietly without luxury. You will vanish from public life. You will relinquish the name, the company, and the legacy you tried to steal. The room was deathly quiet. They were processing the totality of their defeat. They had no cards left to play. It was Helen who spoke, her eyes pleading. And the baby, she whispered, gesturing to her grandson. What about him? I looked at the child sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, blissfully unaware of the wreckage his family had created. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed my face. Not anger, but pity. He will be fine, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. I have already established a separate, protected trust for him. It will fund his education and his future. It is in my name, and it will be administered by my people. He will be taken care of. But you, I looked directly at Helen, then Mark, will never touch a single dollar of it. The choice was on the table: prison and public shame, or exile and quiet obscurity. There was no third option. My father was the first to break. He let out a long, shuddering exhalation, the sound of a man utterly defeated. He looked ancient, as if the weight of his own actions had aged him 20 years in 20 minutes. He reached for the pen Mr. Sterling had so thoughtfully placed on the table. His hand trembled, but he signed. One by one they followed. Mark signed with a barely suppressed rage, his jaw clenched, his signature a vicious slash across the page. Helen signed with silent tears streaming down her face. My mother was the last. She looked at me, her eyes searching for something, a glimmer of pity, a hint of forgiveness, a sign of the daughter she once knew. She found none. Her hand was steady as she signed her name, a final act of capitulation. The scratching of pens was the only sound, the funeral dirge of an empire. When the last document was signed, Mr. Sterling's assistant, a quiet, efficient woman, entered and gathered the folder. She gave me a single, respectful nod, then departed. It was done. They stood to leave, moving like automatons. They were ghosts in the room that had once been the center of their universe. As they reached the doorway, my mother paused. She turned back to look at me, still sitting behind the vast desk. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How long was this in place?" I leaned back in my chair and looked at her, truly looked at her for the last time. "Years," I said, my voice not triumphant, just factual. "Grandma saw who you all were long before I was willing to." The truth hit her harder than any shout ever could. She had been seen, understood, and outmaneuvered by the very woman whose legacy she had tried to erase. She turned without another word and followed the others out. I listened to their footsteps fade down the hall, followed by the faint ding of the elevator that would carry them down and out of my life forever. Outside my window, their little rental car pulled away from the curb, a sad, insignificant vehicle disappearing into the river of traffic. A moment later, a notification popped up on my computer, a secure message from Mr. Sterling. "All documents secured and filed. The transition is complete. Shall we proceed with establishing the foundation?" A small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in weeks. The war was over. The cleanup was finished. Now, the real work could begin. "Yes," I replied. "Let's build something worth inheriting." That evening, the office was silent. The army of lawyers and accountants had gone. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of a million stories. My own story had taken a turn I could never have imagined. I walked to the desk and picked up the silver-framed photo of my grandmother. I looked at her radiant smile, her knowing eyes that seemed to see right through time. She had fought a battle for me before I even knew I was at war. She hadn't just given me an inheritance. She had given me the chance to become the person she always knew I could be. "You were right," I whispered to the photograph, my voice soft in the stillness. The real fortune wasn't the money. It was the foresight. It was the wisdom to see people for who they truly are. It was the strength to prepare for the worst while still hoping for the best. It was the love to build a fortress around someone, not to trap them, but to protect them until they were strong enough to command it themselves. On the desk, my assistant had left one final folder. This one was different. It wasn't filled with bank statements or legal threats. It was filled with hope. I opened it. The cover page read, "Proposal for the Beatrice Evans Foundation." I spent the next hour reading. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful: to provide grants, legal support, and mentorship for women rebuilding their lives after personal or financial betrayal. Women left with nothing. Women who, like me, had their trust shattered by the very people who were supposed to protect them. My family's greed would be transmuted into charity. Their betrayal would become the seed of someone else's recovery. My grandmother's name wouldn't be associated with the quiet, ugly drama of my family, but with strength, resilience, and new beginnings. As I looked out at the glittering skyline, I finally understood. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's not about watching your enemies fall. It's about rising so high they can no longer touch you. It's about building a future so bright it burns away the shadows of the past. It's about living a life that proves you were always the rightful heir, not to their money or their company, but to your own strength and your own peace, and that was a legacy worth fighting for.